So I want to start this segment by asking you a question. And on the surface, it may seem trivial, but it's actually quite existential. The question is this: do fundamental human rights come from government or do they come from God? And I want you to think about this one because how we answer this question can determine whether or not our society slides into totalitarianism or whether it remains free and provides the kind of environment where people are able to actualize their full potential as human beings. Now, believe it or not, there are many in positions of political authority today who will say that fundamental human rights are granted by government and therefore do not have their origin in God and are not intrinsic to human beings. And here's one of them. This is Senator Tim Kaine this year, 2025, talking about precisely this in a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing. And in this clip, he's responding to statements made by Marco Rubio, who does hold that fundamental human rights come only from God.
I'm not really going to ask you about your testimony because I believe you offered that in a very sincere way, and I don't want to try to change your opinion on something you sincerely believe. But the notion that our rights do not come from our laws or our government should make people very, very nervous. To demean laws and demean governments and suggest that rights don't come from laws and governments, I mean, again, I think there are such things as natural rights, and I try to live in accord with them. But I would never demean the law. We are a nation of law, it's not men.
Now, it seems to me clear here that Kaine is actually confusing fundamental human rights, sometimes called natural rights, with imputed rights, which are rights that are granted by government decree. And here there's an important distinction between the two. Fundamental human rights are rights that you were born with as a human being. They are intrinsic to your nature as a human being, and they consist minimally of at least six things: the right to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness, the right to freely worship God, the right to speak freely according to your conscience, which incidentally includes the right not to be compelled by government to say things you don't believe, the right to own property, and the right to self-defense, to protect your own life and that of your family. And so those are the bare minimum fundamental human rights. And from them, of course, flow a bunch of rights that are natural corollaries to them. Rights like freedom of expression, freedom of association, rights to privacy, and so on. Now, imputed rights, on the other hand, are rights that governments impute or grant to their citizens. They're much more arbitrary in nature than fundamental rights and can consist of things like the right to vote when you're 18, the right to drive a motor vehicle, the right to an education, the right to state-funded healthcare, and so on. And obviously these can vary by country or society, and so are not necessarily rights intrinsic to your humanity like fundamental human rights are. Now, why is this distinction important? Well, it's important because there are only two possible sources for fundamental human rights. Either they do come from God, in which case they are not bequeathed by any human government, or they come from human beings and we just make them up. What they can't come from, however, is inert matter, since inert matter is non-sentient and lacks the rational and moral awareness needed to frame them. So, in other words, we're precluded from saying that the universe evolved and fundamental human rights just popped into existence with it. And that because they relate to human dignity and value, of which impersonal natural causes can have no knowledge. So the kind of rights we're talking about, in other words, can therefore only come from a moral and relational being or beings, full stop. So by now you probably get a sense of where this is going and why it's important. If fundamental human rights do not come from God, then all they are human fabrications. And if we simply invent them out of thin air, then we can change them. And if we can change them, we can revoke them. And that means that fundamental human rights are reducible to nothing more than revocable privileges afforded by government. And hence, they are not fundamental human rights, they are reducible to imputed rights. In other words, they are rights that you only have if the government says you have them. If your fundamental human rights come from God, however, then they are intrinsic to your humanity, and government has no say in whether or not you have them. In other words, you're born with them, and it becomes the role and obligation of government to preserve and protect them. More than that, however, it requires government to acknowledge their divine origin and the sovereignty of God over its population. And this is important because once you acknowledge that fundamental human rights do not come from government, then the only other possible origin for them is that they come from God. And if government acknowledges that, then it must inherently acknowledge the supremacy of God and the sovereignty of God over its populations. That's the only other alternative. And of course, history's already revealed to us what happens when governments deny God's existence, meaning that they are inherently atheistic in nature and claim that the only rights people have are the rights that governments accord to them. And the examples that we have of governments that did this followed the political philosophies of Marx and Nietzsche. And so they've been inherently socialist or communist in nature. These kinds of regimes actually take the place of God, and government becomes the absolute authority over their populations. And more than that, if you dispense with God, then human value and dignity cannot have their origin in him, and so they also become arbitrary. And as a consequence, governments like this tend to believe that they can do whatever they want with people, since they have no inherent rights or inherent value as human beings. And of course, these kinds of governments have shown us what they're willing to do to further their ideological ends, with no restraint on the amount of blood they're willing to spill to achieve those ends. And so in the 20th century, 30 million people died under Stalin and Lenin during the Russian Revolution, many in the gulags of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Another 50 million Chinese were killed by Mao Zedong during China's Great Leap Forward in the 1950s and 60s. 2 million more died in the killing fields of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge led by Pol Pot. And another 8 million died under Hitler during World War II, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and 2 million of his own people who were deemed unfit to live because they were chronically ill or handicapped and died in his eugenics program. And another 40 million died trying to stop him. In fact, in the 20th century, over 100 million people died at the hands of government leaders who believed that government alone was responsible for conferring fundamental human rights on their populations. And it was for this reason that more people died in the 20th century under communist and socialist atheistic regimes than all of the religious wars combined throughout history. Now, the framers of the United States Declaration of Independence were prescient enough to recognize the horrors that can result from denying the existence of God and of the fundamental human rights that accompany having been made in his image. And so they began the Declaration with these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." And it was with this knowledge that Ted Cruz brilliantly and passionately responded to Tim Kaine in that same Senate hearing like this.
Mr. Barnes, I'd actually like to go back to the exchange you had with Senator Kaine, and I wish Senator Kaine was still here. Senator Kaine and I were elected together 13 years ago. He is a friend. I would actually encourage observers to go back and listen to what Senator Kaine said, because I have to say I think was disturbing and showed much of where today's Democrat Party has gone wrong. So Senator Kaine said in this hearing that he found it a radical and dangerous notion that you would say our rights came from God and not from government. I just walked into the hearing as he was saying that, and I almost fell out of my chair. Because that radical and dangerous notion, in his words, is literally the founding principle upon which the United States of America was created. And if you do not believe me, and you made reference to this, Mr. Barnes, then you can believe perhaps the most prominent Virginian to ever serve, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator, not by government, not by the Democratic National Committee, but by God, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." I have to say it is stunning to me that the principle that God has given us natural rights is now deemed by Democrats some radical and dangerous notion. Mr. Jefferson was right when he wrote those words. Government exists to protect those rights. But slavery was not okay when U.S. law allowed it. It was wrong then, it is wrong now, it is always wrong.
What a powerful rebuke. And Ted Cruz is absolutely right about this. Now, you may be wondering why we're making this video now, and there are a number of reasons for it. First, you may have noticed that there has been a shift in the political environs of Western governments towards socialism, and you need to know how dangerous it is. And so we feel a need to speak on it. Communism and socialism start out by making all kinds of promises, but because they're inherently Marxist, they don't acknowledge the centrality of God to a healthy civilization. And so they end up destroying them. Second, because these shifts toward totalitarian rule in Canada and Europe and in Australia in particular are happening quickly and are extremely dangerous, we're going to be releasing a number of videos on the interface between faith and politics and why it's important for Christians not only to speak up, but to be involved. And lastly, because there is always another election around the corner. And if you understand the centrality of the Judeo-Christian God to a healthy society, which includes your understanding of where your fundamental human rights come from, you're going to want to make sure that anyone you choose to vote for acknowledges and honors him. Even if you don't have a rich faith yourself, it's critically important. So I want to close this out with a conversation I had yesterday with Grok. And I asked it whether fundamental human rights come from government or from God. And predictably, it gave me the views of both sides of the argument. But I got specific with it and I said, no, I want your answer in a single word. Choose one. Do fundamental human rights come from government or from God? And it said, God. And I said, agreed. And then I asked it why it chose that answer. And here's what it said. Because the most coherent and enduring foundation for unalienable rights, ones that cannot be taken or given away, is a source beyond human power. If rights only come from government, they can be revoked by government. And history shows that that happens. But if they come from God or an objective moral order, they exist prior to any state, and governments are accountable to protect them, not invent them. That single word, God, points to the only authority higher than man that can secure human dignity against tyranny. Wow, that is a great response, and I couldn't have summarized it better. So these kinds of conversations are obviously extremely important. In fact, when you distill them into their essence, they become actually about life and death. And with the radical shift toward communism and socialism occurring within Western governments, we feel it's important to address this subject for you. So we will see you in a future iteration on this subject. In the meantime, may God bless you and may you stand firmly for what's good and what's true.